You walk past them every single day if you live in Washington, D.C. These magnificent structures that define the nation's capital, the buildings that appear on postcards and in history books, the landmarks that symbolize American democracy itself. And yet there's a name you've probably never heard, a story that's been deliberately erased from the architectural records, a black man whose genius shaped the very landscape of power in America, but whose contributions were stolen, minimized, and written out of history for over a century. His name was Benjamin Banneker, and while most people might recognize that name from a vague memory of a scientist or mathematician, what they don't know is the full magnitude of what this man accomplished, or more importantly, how his brilliance was systematically erased from the story of America's most important city. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because while Banneker's contributions to DC's planning are significant, there's another black architect whose work literally defines the capital skyline, whose buildings you recognize instantly, whose designs house the Supreme Court's deliberations and welcome millions of visitors each year. And his name is virtually unknown outside of architectural circles. We're talking about Julian Francis Abele, and if you don't know that name, that's exactly the problem we're here to fix, because this man designed some of the most iconic structures in American history, while facing discrimination so severe that his own firm wouldn't allow his name on the buildings he created, wouldn't let him enter through the front door of structures he had designed, wouldn't even acknowledge his existence in official documents and publications. Imagine creating masterpieces that define a nation's capital and being forced to remain invisible. Imagine your genius being so undeniable that you become the chief designer for one of America's most prestigious architectural firms while simultaneously being treated as less than human because of the color of your skin. This is the story of how a black man's architectural vision shaped Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia and universities across America, how his designs became symbols of democracy while he himself was denied basic democratic rights, and how the systematic erasure of his contributions represents one of the most egregious examples of historical theft in American architecture. Julian Abele was born in Philadelphia in 1881, the son of a minister, growing up in a time when being black and educated was both an achievement and a target, when opportunities were systematically closed off, but when a small black middle class was beginning to emerge despite overwhelming opposition. He showed artistic talent early, drawing and sketching constantly, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of space and structure that his teachers recognized immediately, and in 1898, he became one of the first African Americans admitted to the Pennsylvania Museum and School of Industrial Art, what we now know as the University of the Arts. Think about what that means for a moment, an 18-year-old black man in 1898 entering a predominantly white institution to study architecture, walking into rooms where he was likely the only person who looked like him, sitting in classes where professors might question whether someone of his race could truly understand classical design principles. But Abele didn't just survive this environment, he excelled, graduating in 1902 with honors and immediately facing the harsh reality that no architecture firm in Philadelphia would hire a black designer, no matter how talented, no matter how qualified, because racism wasn't just a personal prejudice, it was official policy, embedded in professional organizations and business practices. So Abele took a job as a part-time teacher while continuing to develop his skills, and this is where fate, or perhaps recognition of undeniable genius, intervened in the form of Horace Trumbauer, one of Philadelphia's most prominent architects, a man who had built his reputation designing mansions for America's wealthiest families, but who apparently recognized something extraordinary in this young black architect. In 1902, Trumbauer hired Abele as a draftsman, and this began one of the most complicated and fascinating relationships in American architectural history, because over the next 46 years, Abele would rise to become the firm's chief designer, the creative genius behind virtually every major project the firm undertook, while Trumbauer's name alone appeared on all the buildings, in all the publications, in all the official records. Now, some historians have tried to paint Trumbauer as a progressive hero for hiring Abele at all, for recognizing his talent and giving him opportunities, but let's be absolutely clear about what was really happening here. Trumbauer benefited enormously from Abele's genius while Abele remained hidden, uncredited, unable to advance his own name or reputation because the architectural establishment and society at large would not accept a black man as the designer of buildings for white. institutions, and wealthy white families. Abele was sent to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris from 1903 to 1904, becoming one of the first black architects to attend that prestigious institution, and there, away from American racism, he immersed himself in classical European architectural principles, studying the grand boulevards and monuments that would later influence his designs for American institutions. When he returned to Philadelphia, his talent was undeniable, his training was world-class, his understanding of Beaux-Arts principles was as good as any white architect in America, and yet he still couldn't put his name on his work, still couldn't meet with clients, still had to enter buildings through back doors and service entrances. By 1908, Abele had become indispensable to Trumbauer's firm, and this is when the commissions that would define American institutional architecture began flowing in, and this is when Abele's genius truly emerged. Duke University, that sprawling Gothic campus in Durham, North Carolina, with its soaring chapel and perfectly proportioned quads, was almost entirely designed by Julian Abele. Drawing by drawing, building by building, he created what would become one of America's most recognizable university campuses, a masterpiece of collegiate Gothic architecture that combines medieval European aesthetics with modern American functionality. Think about the audacity of that for a moment. A black man in the Jim Crow South designing the campus where wealthy white students would be educated, creating spaces of learning and privilege that he himself would never be welcome to enter as anything other than a servant, and doing it with such skill and vision that the campus would be celebrated for generations as an architectural triumph. The Duke Chapel alone, that magnificent structure with its 210-foot tower, its intricate stone carvings, its soaring interior spaces, was Abele's design, every detail, every proportion, every element carefully considered and executed, and yet for decades, only Trumbauer's name appeared in connection with the project. But Duke wasn't even close to his only major work, and this is where the scale of the erasure becomes truly staggering, because Abele designed the central wing of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, that iconic building at the end of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway that you've seen in countless movies and photographs, the building whose steps Rocky runs up in that famous scene. He designed the Free Library of Philadelphia's Central Branch, a magnificent Beaux-Arts structure that serves as a temple to knowledge and learning, again creating spaces of culture and education while being denied equal access to those very spaces because of his race. He designed Widener Memorial Library at Harvard University, the largest library on campus, a building that houses one of the greatest collections of books and manuscripts in the world, and once again, Abele created this monument to learning while facing discrimination in his own pursuit of professional recognition. The central branch of the Free Library, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Harvard's Widener Library, Duke University's entire campus, these aren't just buildings, they're American landmarks. They're the structures that define institutional America, that represent learning, culture, and power, and they were all designed by a black man who wasn't allowed to take credit for his own genius. Now here's where it gets even more complicated and more revealing about systemic racism in America, because it wasn't just that Abele wasn't credited, it's that he was actively hidden, his existence was downplayed or denied, and when his role couldn't be completely erased, it was minimized to the point of insignificance. White architectural historians would write entire books about Trumbauer's work without mentioning Abele's name. Professional journals would publish detailed analyses of these buildings without acknowledging that a black man designed them. And this wasn't an accident or an oversight, this was deliberate erasure. A conscious decision to maintain the fiction that great American architecture was created exclusively by white men. Abele himself rarely spoke publicly about this injustice, partly because that was his personality. He was described as quiet and dignified, focused on the work itself rather than public recognition, but also because speaking out would have meant losing his position, losing his ability to design at all, because a black man who challenged white supremacy in the early 20th century risked everything, his career, his safety, even his life. So Abele worked in the background, his genius undeniable to those who worked with him, his designs transforming American institutional architecture, his influence shaping how we think about academic spaces, cultural institutions, and civic buildings, and all the while he remained virtually invisible to the public, to history, to the record of American achievement. By 1938, when Horace Trumbauer died, Abele had been the firm's chief designer for decades, the creative force behind virtually every major project, and yet he still couldn't officially lead the firm, couldn't put his name first on the letterhead, because white clients wouldn't accept a black man as their architect, wouldn't trust a black man to design their buildings, no matter how many masterpieces he had already created. The firm eventually closed in 1950, just a few years before Abele's death in 1950, and he spent those final years still largely unknown outside of architectural circles, still uncredited for many of his greatest works, still fighting against the erasure that had defined his entire career. But here's what they couldn't erase: the buildings themselves, standing as monuments to Abele's genius even when his name was stripped from them. Because you can remove a name from a plaque, but you can't remove the brilliance of the design, the perfect proportions, the thoughtful integration of form and function, the way these spaces make you feel when you enter them. Students at Duke University walk through spaces designed by a black man every single day. Visitors to the Philadelphia Museum of Art admire architecture created by a black man without knowing it. Harvard scholars research in a library designed by a black man whose contributions were deliberately hidden. And this is the insidious nature of historical erasure. It allows people to enjoy the fruits of black genius while denying black people credit for their contributions. Now, you might be wondering how we even know about Abele's contributions if they were so thoroughly erased. And that's a testament to the work of later historians, particularly black historians and architectural scholars who refused to accept the official narrative, who dug through firm records and personal papers and correspondence to piece together the truth of who actually designed these buildings. In the 1970s and 1980s, decades after Abele's death, researchers began publishing evidence of his role as chief designer, showing through drawings and documents and testimony from people who had worked with him that he was the creative genius behind Trumbauer's most famous projects. And slowly, painfully slowly, the recognition began to come. Duke University, the institution whose entire campus Abele designed, didn't fully acknowledge his contributions until 1986, 36 years after his death, when they finally named a building after him, a small gesture that couldn't possibly repay the debt owed to the man who created their architectural identity. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Free Library, Harvard, these institutions have gradually, reluctantly begun to acknowledge Abele's role, adding his name to plaques and historical materials. But even now, even in 2024, most people who visit these buildings have no idea that they were designed by a black man, that the spaces they admire and photograph and study in were created by someone who faced discrimination so severe that he couldn't even be acknowledged as their designer. And this brings us to the broader pattern that Abele's story reveals, because he wasn't the only black architect, inventor, scientist, or creator whose contributions were stolen or minimized. He's part of a systematic pattern of erasure that permeates American history, where black excellence is either hidden, attributed to white people, or simply denied altogether. Think about all the buildings across America designed by black architects who couldn't get credit, all the inventions created by black innovators who couldn't patent their work or whose patents were stolen, all the scientific discoveries made by black researchers who were excluded from recognition and awards, all the cultural contributions made by black artists who watched white performers profit from their creativity. This wasn't individual prejudice. This was systematic theft, embedded in professional organizations and legal structures and social norms, designed to maintain the fiction of white superiority by hiding evidence of black genius. Abele's story also reveals something crucial about the nature of institutional racism, because it shows how discrimination operates not just through outright exclusion, but through controlled inclusion that benefits white people while exploiting black talent. Trumbauer's firm benefited enormously from having Abele's genius, won commissions because of his design abilities, built its reputation on his creativity, and yet Abele remained subordinate, uncredited, unable to advance his own career independently because the system was designed to extract his labor and talent while denying him equality. This is the same pattern we see throughout American history. Black people's contributions are valued and exploited while black people themselves are devalued and denied recognition, creating a system where white institutions profit from black excellence while maintaining racial hierarchy. And let's be clear about what Abele's designs represent architecturally, because understanding the significance of his work makes the erasure even more egregious. His Beaux-Arts designs, with their classical proportions and grand spaces, help define how American institutions present themselves, how universities create a sense of tradition and academic gravitas, how museums and libraries signal cultural importance and civic pride. These aren't just functional buildings, they're statements about values and aspirations, they're physical embodiments of American institutional identity. And the fact that so much of that identity was shaped by a black man who was denied equality reveals a profound hypocrisy at the heart of American culture. Abele was creating temples to learning and democracy and culture while being denied access to those very ideals himself, designing spaces that symbolized American values while experiencing American racism, and the buildings themselves stand as monuments to both his genius and the injustice he faced. Today, there's growing recognition of Abele's contributions. Architectural historians now widely acknowledge his role as the primary designer for Trumbauer's major projects. Universities and museums have begun adding his name to their historical records. And in 2007, Duke University Press published a comprehensive biography that finally told his full story. But recognition that comes decades after death doesn't repair the harm, doesn't give Abele the career he deserved, doesn't compensate him for the commissions he couldn't pursue independently, doesn't restore the years he spent watching others take credit for his work. And the broader pattern of erasure continues, because while we're slowly acknowledging Abele, how many other black architects and designers and creators remain unknown? Their contributions still hidden, their names still absent from the historical record? The systematic nature of this erasure means that we're still discovering the full extent of black contributions to American culture and institutions, still finding evidence that was deliberately hidden or destroyed, still fighting to restore names and stories that white supremacy tried to erase. So the next time you see images of Duke University's Gothic campus, or the Philadelphia Museum of Art's grand facade, or Harvard's Widener Library, remember Julian Francis Abele. Remember that these American landmarks were designed by a black man whose genius was undeniable but whose recognition was denied, whose creativity shaped institutional America while he himself was denied institutional equality. Remember that the buildings you admire, the spaces you consider beautiful and significant, were often created by people whose contributions were deliberately hidden because acknowledging black excellence threatened white supremacy's foundational lie. Remember that history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember and record and teach, and that for too long we've chosen to erase black contributions to hide black genius, to pretend that American achievement was exclusively white when the truth is that black people have been central to every aspect of American development, often despite overwhelming opposition and systematic theft of credit. Julian Abele died in 1950 at the age of 69. Having designed some of America's most significant buildings while remaining virtually unknown, having transformed American institutional architecture while being denied the recognition and opportunities his white peers took for granted. And his story isn't just about one man's genius and one man's unjust treatment, it's about a systematic pattern of erasure that we're still working to undo. Share this story, speak his name, and the next time someone admires Duke University's campus or visits the Philadelphia Museum of Art, tell them about Julian Francis Abele, the black architect whose genius shaped American landmarks but whose name was stolen from history, because the only way we prevent future erasure is by actively recovering and celebrating the contributions that past generations tried to hide.